various issues. So whether we're talking about gender-based violence, where we're talking about educating girls, we are talking about the need to deal with the mental issues, or deal with drug abuse. Oftentimes we may think that we go into a community and just address them, and hopefully that that drug abuse would reduce. But this, of course, requires a very clear strategy on who it is that you want to invite, say, to a baraza, or who you want to invite to even a webinar or such a Zoom meeting, because it is by inviting that a group of people and talking to them that you hope that you cultivate them, that you hope that their message or your message is clear to them, and consequently that you can use them to also communicate the message to others. But also the kind of people that you also want to invite to physical or in-person meetings, as opposed to a Zoom meeting. Of course, technologies are important. Technologies have made it perhaps easier for us to have such conversations. But oftentimes, you go to an in-person meeting, and people are more animated. There's a lot more connection between the speakers or the organizations and the attendees, as opposed to, say, a Zoom meeting where someone can just log in and continue doing their own thing. Even in a classroom situation, sometimes this becomes problematic, and we've seen that the efficacy or the efficiency of such platforms are not, the efficacy, let me just use that word, is not as good in an online platform as opposed to a physical meeting. But also, it depends on who it is that you're dealing with. Perhaps with younger people that are interested in technology, younger people that would be technologically savvy in terms of technology, or they possess, of course, the literacy to use such platforms. They would be more interested or be more engaged in such a platform. But when you ask perhaps older people to attend such meetings, they may lose interest. Their attention span of, some of them may be, less than maybe 20 minutes. And consequently, it might not be as effective as, say, as holding an in-person meeting. So, when we ask ourselves, what is a communication strategy and how can we execute that communication strategy, it becomes important for you to be able to demonstrate to your organization, to demonstrate to your staff, or to demonstrate to the management that communication is always important in whatever it is that you do. In reaching out to the donors, in reaching out to the supporters, in reaching out to the people, a communication strategy becomes key. So, you might think that you don't want to spend the scarce resources because that should go into the core work. But at the end of the day, communication and effective communication is important. We always say also spend money to get money, and communication becomes then a key element in any work. So what is the essence of good or effective communication? And I've underlined some of the key, issues or key terminologies that I think are important whenever it is that we're thinking about effective communication. And I've said that, good communication is two-way. It's a two-way dialogue. And even in this environment, if I'm talking to myself, then, this conversation will not be effective. It will be a monologue. It will be me talking to you and you listening and perhaps trying to imbibe or trying to understand what I'm saying. But for it to be a deeper engagement, it must be a two-way. It must be you talking to me, me sharing with you what I think, me sharing with you the ideas that I think are important, and you responding to them, or you, again, challenging the ideas that I have and sharing what you think maybe from the grassroots, what is important. In sharing, for example, we say vitu kwa ground ni tofauti. So I might be thinking that this is the most important thing that we ought to communicate on. But when you listen to people, then you start to think maybe whatever I've been thinking is the most important message, perhaps is not. Again, for example, when we think about gender-based violence, we may be thinking that asking women or encouraging women, for example, to report on the abuses that they face, to report the violence to the police or to the authorities is the most important thing. But you go to a baraza or you go to a physical meeting, and those same women or the men that would be in that meeting would tell you that education would be the most important activity to engage in, because education creates some sort of understanding. Education gives them the knowledge on the consequences of, for example, physical violence or emotional violence. Because many of us might not understand that psychological emotional violence is as bad as physical violence. And consequently, then we seem to spend a lot more resources on trying to deal with physical violence without acknowledging the fact that emotional violence would lead to mental health issues, would contribute to suicide and such other challenges that we face in society. So a two-way dialogue is always important, because it gives us an opportunity to listen. And we always say maybe listening is important before even talking, because by listening, we understand what the people, what the audiences that we're talking with or talking to really want, really privilege, the issues that they face. And then trying to respond in, of course, a respectable way, in a way that demonstrates that we empathize with the issues. And again, a good communication ensures that we design and deliver audience-informed strategies. We're not talking to ourselves. We have various audiences. And in any, for example, society, and I mentioned this earlier, we try and disaggregate, a community into specific target audiences. So if you're, again, looking at the issues of the girl child and girl education, we may think that, the first audience that we target are the girls themselves. But in talking to people, in it being a two-way dialogue, we might realize that the target audience would be parents. The target audiences would be the leaders within a certain community. So that, by talking to parents and identifying that the main or target audience is parents, we're encouraging them to take their girls to school. We're trying to give them information on the importance of educating their girls, so that at the end of the day, by being a two-way dialogue, we understand what is, for example, preventing the parents from taking their girls to school. How can we deal with cultures that do not support the taking of girls to school or empowering the girls, or giving girls and women a voice? And, by then ensuring that we understand what the people we are trying to communicate with, what their issues are, that would ensure that there is effective communication. So audience-informed strategies are always important. And in talking to one another, in being a two-way dialogue, it is important that we think about the kind of feedback that we receive from the various audiences that we are dealing with. Feedback is always important. Even in, mass-mediated environment, where, for instance, a radio would communicate from the fewer to the larger community. So you can imagine in the era of KBC, there was some people sitting in Nairobi, or, when we're looking at local language stations, I think these were based almost everywhere. But there was perhaps a little opportunity for feedback. So we communicated from, say, Nairobi or the major towns in this country, and hoped that the people would understand the messages. But feedback is always important, because they would tell you whether the radio is effective. They would tell you whether if you focus a lot on maybe taking the girls to school rather than dealing with the cultures that stop girls from being taken to school, cultures that would support, for example, early marriage, cultures that would prevent the empowerment of girls. By dealing with those, then you understand how to deal with the problem. Remember what I said earlier, that any communication is based on, for example, identifying a problem. And by receiving this feedback, you try and generate some responses, or generate the solutions to the issues that you're facing, or the problem that you've already identified. So a two-way dialogue deals with feedback. And you as a communication expert then communication experts have to assess that feedback to determine, for example, how it can be applied in this two-way dialogue, and how to communicate the same feedback. In some communities, for example, the religious communities, for instance, in Garissa or Wajir, and some parts of Isiolo, where Islam, for example, is the most dominant religion, it would be difficult for you to speak to both men and women in the same meeting. I was in Garissa, for example, not long ago, talking to on the issues of refugees. And despite the fact that we had women in the meeting, it was very difficult for us to get them to speak, based on the fact that in that environment, men ostensibly spoke on behalf of the women. But we, in many of these instances, men would be speaking on the issues and assuming that represents what women feel about refugee issues and dealing with refugee challenges that we have in this country. So perhaps one of the most effective ways of making this the communication effective would have been for us to have women in their own space, and perhaps the meeting run by women, so that they feel at ease. Apparently, when women speak to other women in that environment, they may open up. Whilst men, of course, sometimes it doesn't matter whether they're speaking in a space where they're both men and women, both men and women. So perhaps for men, it doesn't hold them back, but for women and for girls, it will definitely hold them back. And if you want to get, for example, what girls feel about their own education or their own empowerment, it might be better for you as a communication expert to speak just to the girls in a different environment. Speak to the girls, speak to the men, and occasionally maybe bring the men and women together so that you can tell them that this is what the women said and this is what the men said, and does that reflect, for example, the current reality. So that feedback, when you assess it, then it becomes, key to you understanding how the two groups, for example, communicate and the issues that they would privilege in such an environment. And that would help you also assess the impact of your communication. Remember, you're dealing with scarce resources. Scarce resources is not just about monetary resources. You're talking about human resources that would be deployed to engage in communication. You're talking about the time that you have to communicate a certain message. If you don't, for example, draw time-bound, again, we shall see this, time-bound communication strategies or objectives, then you might be communicating communicating the same message over and over again without getting any results, without any impact being felt in, in the kind of activity that you are engaging in, or in the kind of objectives that or purpose for which you've set up the organization. Effective communication should be well-defined, a well-defined process for achieving long-term communication and organizational goals. So well-defined process, which means that you must define why it is that you communicate. Earlier I asked the question, why do you want to communicate? Is it just for the purpose of it, for the sake of it rather? Is it just that you feel that you have information that you need to pass on to various audiences? Or is it that you have to disaggregate people, put them in different target groups, and then draw messages for those different audiences? Because, if you want your communication to be effective, it is important to draw those audiences, know what the channels that you want to communicate, know what kind of messaging that you want to draw, know what, for example, budget is available, what resources are available, what people are available. So if you're going to, for example, address a baraza, you must, for instance, invite maybe the local leadership if you want your communication to be effective. If you're dealing with gender-based violence, who do you need to invite? You invite the local leadership, of course. You invite maybe the judicial officers, because they'll talk about the prosecution and the consequences of engaging in gender-based violence. So the authoritative, speakers would, of course, support whatever it is that you're dealing with. So, in other words, anyway, this is a well-defined process that takes into consideration what you already have, the resources that you have, monetary, human, and even media resources and time resources, because time is, a scarce resource. If you want to achieve results, and if you want to ensure that you achieve certain results, then you set yourself targets. You say that by the end of this year, I must have communicated this message. I must have assessed the impact of what it is that you're communicating. So long-term strategies, communication is, of course, important. What do you want to achieve in the short term, in the mid-term, in the long term? And do those then address the organizational goals? Because, there are various organizations on this platform. I see that you work in different sectors, or you want to promote various issues. So, do you understand the organizational goals? And how do those organizational goals then align to the kind of communications that you want to engage in? So organizational goals, and this relates to the issue of mission and vision, are always important. The elements, including sustained and consistent information, I think is important. Coordination is important. The complementarity, internal and external communication is important. I talked earlier about the vertical, for instance, vertical and horizontal targets that you're dealing with. We talk about stakeholders, for instance, internal and external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders would, of course, be everybody that is involved in the kind of work that you do in the organizational goals. And so if, for example, the people that deal with the programmatic work do not understand the importance of communication, then it will become very difficult for you to execute a communication strategy. And this is why, if you're a communication expert or communication officer within an organization, you have to work very closely with the people that deal with program work, so that you can infuse, or you can have a communication strategy within whatever it is that they do. Again, I keep going to the issue of gender-based violence or girl education, because I think it's important. So if you're thinking about addressing, for example, the inequalities between boys and girls in education, how do you convince the program officer that deals with, say, education, or program officer that deals with violence, that there is need for you to have a communication strategy within their own program? Because the bigger communication strategy, which deals with the organizational goals and organizational communication, might look very big from that programmatic work that they do. But for you to be able then to get to that level, important that the program officers understand the importance of communication, the importance of the different elements of communication, for it to be coordinated, and for you to work in an environment where the management, for example, support what it is that you're doing. And this sometimes is challenging in the sense that program officers or the management might not understand why they need to spend a lot of money in inviting journalists or trying to segment or disaggregate audiences, because to them there is a cause that they want to support based on organizational goals, and consequently, they want to communicate with everybody because they think that the general public or general audiences is important rather than targeted audiences. So for you as a communication expert ought to, of course, understand, the importance of targeted communication. Targeted communication at a certain point, but also, of course, that the general audience is also important at some point. So the secondary audience also need to know what it is that you're dealing with. Is there any questions up to that point? Any comments? As I said, maybe this ought to be a two-way dialogue rather than me talking to you. So it's not a monologue. Yes, Mark, I'll share this. I'll share the presentation. Caroline, I don't know what I need to repeat. All right, anyway, so we proceed. I hope that you can hear me. First, let me just confirm that. I don't want to go on and nobody is hearing me. But I don't want to make these, yes.
I can hear you here. Yeah, so you're quite loud and clear.
All right, thanks, Mustafa.
Yes, but I guess our participants also may need to confirm this because they are the people who are supposed to hear you more than anyone.
Definitely.
Yes, we can hear you, Professor. You are clear.
All right. Thanks, Jen. So any questions or comments before I proceed? Anyway, all right. So let me proceed because I realize it's already 10. So I think the next 30 minutes maybe I should stop so that we can maybe move to the next stage. Any questions, comments, and we can share. I think I've talked about identifying, segmenting, studying, and listening to potential audiences. I've mentioned that the identification of primary audiences is always important, because in any communication strategy, there's people that you want to communicate with directly, and studying what it is, for example, that they privilege, and listening to them. So, for instance, when we segment them, we say, again, maybe let's use our usual example, girls' voices or women's voices, gender-based violence. You may want to segment your audiences into women, the women and women leaders, or the local leadership, national leadership, And what then does that mean in terms of communication, in terms of what it is that you want to use? You may know that perhaps at a national level, these are the people that ought to be listening to you. So when we're dealing with gender-based violence, here you want women leadership, for instance. You want to deal with the department that handles gender issues. You want to deal with the judiciary. You want to deal with the police or law enforcement agencies. You want to also perhaps get to the presidency because maybe the presidency gives direction to the executive arm of government. You also want to deal with institutions of decision-making like parliament, both at the devolved and national, for example, national government. So, if you're looking at national government or national level in terms of parliament, then you ask yourself how, for example, what MPs or which MPs might help in whatever it is that you're doing. Oftentimes in parliament, there are committees, for example, that deal with various issues. There are committees on education, there are committees on investment, there are committees that deal with security matters, there are committees that deal with corruption, for instance. And consequently, if you're in those areas, you want to identify which committees that you want to work with. And committees in parliament are fairly effective in the sense that it is at the committee stage that many things get done. It is the committees that would identify an issue and pick it up with the speaker, and then the speaker picks it up with the with the different houses. For example, we know that we have a two-tier parliament system in this country: the National Assembly and the Senate. And so if we're looking at National Assembly, we are looking at if you can be able to identify the committee, identify particular MPs. I think that would be important in your messaging, because in your communication strategy, because by targeting that group, you know that they'll be able to listen to you. You know that you're dealing with a smaller group from a larger group that may not have the time and even the capacity to listen to you. And ideally then reaching out to them using various strategies. It could be that you write letters to them, you email them, you call them, and you visit them, because that way you're able to deal with that smaller audience, from which then you hope that a bigger audience would be drawn. So it's important for you to identify and segment and study that audience as a way of understanding it and as a way of trying to see what strategies can be employed in dealing with them. Of course, again, it's the conception, production, and coordination of communication. That is especially, and I'm sure maybe you saw this yesterday when you dealt with communication for change. At the end of the day, you want to be able to change perceptions, and public perceptions are always important. This is how people, for example, perceive you. I talked about, the tensions that oftentimes exist between civil society and media, or tensions that exist between civil society and the communities in which they work. If you're dealing with gender-based violence in places like Garissa and Isiolo and Wajir, sometimes they may think that you're trying to create, feminist or advanced feminism in those organizations. An adversarial, for example, feminism or Western feminism that would seem to create ideas of equality in societies that may be conservative, societies that understand, for example, the different roles between men and women, or the different roles that are played by men and women. So the public perceptions and changing them, affecting them through, these coordinated communication is important. Perceptions, attitude, and beliefs. Oftentimes, this is what we actually want to change: attitudes and beliefs and perceptions. And of course, then ultimately the behaviors of the various audiences and various communities in which you work. I've talked about, any communication strategy aligning to the mission and vision of your organization, because, once you deal with internal stakeholders, you want to ensure that, they understand the importance of communication to achieving the mission of the organization. So the mission, for instance, and mission is normally quite smart. So if you want to be able to eradicate, for example, child poverty by the year 2030, you must, of course, then change the behaviors of the people that engaged, say, in corruption or engaged in misappropriation of public funds, because we know that corruption, for example, leads to poverty to a large extent, because by stealing public funds, it means we cannot invest in education. We cannot invest in, empowerment strategies, economic empowerment strategies. And consequently, you then ensuring that the internal stakeholders understand the importance of engaging in communication to deal with this mission of eradicating poverty by 2030, and the importance of communication going to different, for example, demographics and talking to them about poverty, dealing with, the segmented audiences about poverty, and them understanding what poverty means in the context of society. And that is the mission. And you're able then to articulate that clearly to the internal stakeholders. I think you'd get a lot of support. Of course, the mission and vision are related. And one of the most important things at the end of the day is to monitor, measure, and assess the effects of communication strategies. Oftentimes we think that we're going to communicate and the message will be, would be known to the people that you've communicated with. Earlier, we talked about trying to cultivate relationships between you as an organization and journalists and media organizations. But unless you're able to monitor and measure that relationship, then you may think that the journalists understand the issues that you're dealing with, and consequently would be sympathetic to your cause. But that is not always the case. We talked about the amount of information that is available to the journalists and the number of issues that they have to deal with every day. So unless you monitor, for example, what that relationship means, it may be that, no journalist understands what it is that you do. And unless you're able then to measure the amount of airtime that you receive, or the amount of space that you get in the papers, for example, the amount of space or messages that you get on social media, you'll not be able to determine what the effects of any communication or intervention that you've put in place. There's something that we call a return on investment. Return on investment is not just applied, for example, to business organizations, that you invest maybe a certain amount of money and you'd expect a certain amount of return as a result of that investment. Even in what you do, for example, the investments of your time in this class, you invested your time in this class. Instead of going to do your daily work, you've decided to come to this meeting. So the opportunity cost of, you're going to work is attending this meeting. And so at the end of the day, and perhaps when Mustafa asked earlier, what is the one thing that you picked from yesterday's session, that is some sort of assessment of at least some basic assessment of what it is that you've gained from this intervention. And this intervention is the capacity building or training. So, when, for example, Bernard and Mustafa, and I think I see Mercy here, want to assess the effectiveness of this intervention, the capacity building, they'll say the basic one is how many people attended. That is the basic one. Attended the meeting, attended this training. But ultimately, it is what has come out of this capacity building. If you go on to become better communicators, if you go on to develop and execute communication strategies, then that will be a better measure and impact of this intervention. And that's what you want at the end of the day. You want to be able to monitor, measure, and assess the effects of any communication strategy that you've developed and executed. So if you're dealing with, again, the girl child, or giving a voice to girls and women, if you're dealing with trying to eradicate the drug menace in this country, or alcoholism, you want to say that as a result of you engaging in a certain communication, you've been able to ensure that there's no drug dealing, for example, in that in the area that you work in. There's a reduction in gender-based violence. There's an increase in the number of girls that go to school because of the information that is shared, the communication that you engaged in with parents. There is increased, for example, interest from teachers and leaders in the area, so that, if no girls are going to school, or if girls are actually found in the marketplace, they'll be forced, or their parents will be forced to take them to school. Then you know that you become effective. And it's important to draw or come up with mechanisms for monitoring, measuring, and assessing the impact of any communication strategy. The return on investment is always important in whatever it is that you do. And through the assessment, if something is not working, then you say, maybe we need to try something else. And this is based on, of course, the feedback, based on the kind of assessment that you've done and the feedback that you received perhaps from the people. So if this, for example, platform is not working as a Zoom training, we may then think that the next training should be an in-person training, based on, of course, the feedback that you give the host of this meeting. And that is part of monitoring, measuring, and assessing the impact of any activity that you engage in. So the principles of good, effective communication, a deep comprehension or deep understanding of the attitudes, cultures, identities, and behaviors of the environment in which you work in the social system that you find yourself in is important. Culture is, is both a facilitator and sometimes an impediment to whatever it is that you do. Remember, the culture of, for example, appreciation, the culture of respect in various organizations, but the culture of toxic masculinity, for example, I think we've heard that numerous times. Culture of patriarchy, sometimes not helpful in certain issues that you want to engage in. And, if cultures are an impediment to whatever it is that you do, then you might want to be able to change the attitudes of your target audiences or the people that you're targeting with your communication. Because at the end of the day, the attitudes towards, say, gender-based violence, or the attitudes towards girl education and girl empowerment, the attitudes towards, poverty would contribute to how effective any communication is. So, you know, and I think I've talked about the exchange of ideas to promote understanding and build relationships. I think that is important, you know, collaboration is always also very important, particularly for organizations that don't want to duplicate things, organizations that want to utilize, for example, available resources to ensure that, you know, if all of you are working in gender, you know, in gender areas, or trying to promote the gender issues, if you want to promote women involvement in politics, or involvement or participation in politics, why should you be competing in the same space? Why should you be competing to utilize resources that would have perhaps achieved better results if all of you came together, drew a strategy for communicating with various identified target audiences, after obviously segmenting those audiences and saying, this is perhaps who we need to communicate with within a specific period, using certain resources, using certain channels. It should be a collaborative effort anyway. And I think I saw someone, did someone raise their hand? Again, was it Shakes or something? No? All right, I'm trying to go as fast as possible because I see that we don't have much time. So anyway, the principles, there are so many principles of effective or good or effective communication, including broader discussion to align actions, images, and words to support various things that you want to engage in, including policy, overarching strategic objectives and longer term goals, the missions that you have.
Sorry, did we lose Professor Nabuga? Or it's just my internet? Or it's just my internet?
No, it seems that we lost him.
Oh yes, okay. Hopefully he's able to reconnect really quick so we can continue. I will check with him now to see. But I hope everyone is finding, you know, this presentation from Prof useful and relevant, and you could use it as a springboard, you know, a stepping stone, you know, as a resource that you could use to actually go back and reflect, you know, to go back and reflect on building or creating a communication strategy. For some of you who may already have formed strategies within your institutions, well, maybe this is also an opportunity for you to reflect, to go back to see whether, you know, there is anything new you can do to you know, to improve on the existing strategy that you already have. You know, but a comm strategy is certainly very important, you know, a thing to have for your organization. It's that kind of documents that help, you know, you to know which media to target, who to work with, and you know, who to work with, and you know, what the approach you use to share that information. The approach you will use to share that information. Will you share it first? You know, will you share it first online or on social media? Will you do a press conference to, you know, get journalists together and then you release the data to them? Many ways, and each of those options you choose, right? each of those options you choose, definitely you should be able to justify those options. I think we will take a quick break. Also, while we wait for Professor Nyambuga, we've not taken a break this morning. Let's take a quick break to have tea or take a walk. Take a break and resume in 10 minutes.
Now, as a child, grew up in the trauma, gender-based violence in very simple terms. Hello, everybody. I'm back. And sorry.
Yeah, Prof. I think we lost you on the internet. So what we are trying to do, we decided since we have not even taken a break, we can just maybe then allow get people to take a quick health break for a walk or take tea and then we'll resume in 10 minutes.
Oh, in 10 minutes. Okay, very good then. Okay.
That works. Yes.
All right. Then I'll try and get my connection working. I've connected using my phone, my phone as an access point. I don't know at what point I dropped out.
Okay. That's it. Well, that's a big test for everyone in the group. To remind to remind Prof where you stopped off so that we know everyone was paying attention.
All right. Okay. Good. And what time do you want to stop, Mustafa?
So we'll be resuming at 10:30. 25 minutes to 11. That's when we'll resume.
Okay. And then we go on until.
And then we can go until 11:30. But by 11:30 we should be done.
All right. Okay. Good. Then thanks.
Before midday.
Okay. Good.
Right.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome.
Gender-based violence has affected my family, especially for me who grew up in a family with domestic violence, whereby we watch the physical abuse and the emotional abuse. Now, as a child, you grew up watching that, then you grew up with the trauma. Gender-based violence in very simple terms is violence inflicted on a person because of their gender. Gender-based violence is not just a problem for the women. It also affects men, but due to cultural and social norms, man is so a lot of men don't come to speak. Typically, it does not have a way into our homes. It follows us to our workplaces and the public places. It's quite femicide, which is killing due to its violence. It's one of our biggest issues, and it's by the sensation of love. My culture actually is to study education from primary school, targeting adolescents and youth, and teaching them that LGBT is not an occurrence. For investigators, collaborate to humanize the tests to ensure that their professionals government is to resource the government is to make shelters to exist shelters. Yes,
Yes, Mustafa.
All right, I think we're back. And my apologies. Hello, Bernard, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Prof. You're audible.
All right, okay, very good. So shall we continue, or how do you call Mustafa?
Yes, Prof, we can continue.
Proceed.
Yeah.
All right, okay.
I think your starting point is to check for someone to remind you where you,
Yes.
where it went off exactly.
The last thing that they had me say. Are we back, colleagues? Are we back? Can someone confirm? Isabel, Mariam, Manuel, Mark, Matthew, Shakes, Michael, Kyoko, Peggy. Can someone confirm that you're back?
Yes, Prof, we're back.
We're back.
All right, very good. Well, all right. Mustafa said, what was the last thing that you had me say? Because I think I had dropped off and I kept talking, but I realized that I was talking to myself when the screen showed that it was connecting. Can someone remind me or tell me what the last thing that you had? All right, maybe I was talking to myself. At this rate.
So, Prof, I think from my points, the last thing I had that you said, and I was hoping someone else could have provided that, but if you just go back to the, I think if you just go back to the slides, they will help, because I think you were discussing different ways of like communicating, like the slides will help. Yeah.
There we are. Can you see them?
Yes.
Okay, so we had gotten there.
Yeah. So I think.
All right. That's the slide that where I was. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So
anyway, so I'm hoping that everybody heard that what we talked is about collaborative process, and there's no need for you to work in your silos. Instead, it's important to be collaborative, to work with one another, to utilize the resources that you have, to engage in some sort of strategic communication horizontally and, of course, across stakeholders. And we mentioned that, for instance, if you're working in an environment where you're trying to eradicate the drug menace, or deal with gender-based violence, or try to promote girl empowerment, try to promote the girls or women voices, and all of you and the various organizations that work in that space, there's need to collaborate. Both among the organizations, but also ensure that you put perhaps your resources into trying to achieve the objectives, collective objectives of the organizations that work in that space. In other words, there's no need for competition, especially if you work in the same sector. There's no need for trying to utilize scarce resources for each one of you to achieve maybe a certain a very narrow objective. Instead, you can collaborate, you can work together, you can partner to ensure that there are bigger returns on investment of the resources that you have. And remember, resources are not just financial, but also human capacity and time resources, given that time is also very scarce. If you want to achieve something by the end of this year, or if you want to achieve something by the time we go into the elections on 9th, is it 9th or 8th, one of those, then you should ensure that you utilize the resources that you have, well. But anyway, so we proceed. I think I talked about that, that any communication is inherently risky, and accepting risk is part of trying to improve the process of communication. And that, communication is, entails continuous, a continuous process of research and analysis, planning, execution, and assessment. So assessment, for example, shouldn't just be at the end of the year. It is, if you're engaged in enhancing, for example, women participation in elections, after the election, ideally, then you should do some sort of assessment to determine how effective you are with your communication. And if you then, find out that maybe certain elements were effective or successful and others were not, you may want to go back to the drawing board and try to see what is it that did not work and why is it that it didn't work, as a way of mitigating those challenges or coming up with solutions to ensure that the next communication activity you engage in obviously deals with those challenges. If you segmented the audiences wrongly, then the solution will be deploying strategies to come up with audiences that you think are critical to the work that you do. In other words, anyway, it's a continuous process of research and analysis and assessment. And assessment, as we said, is especially critical because you want to be able to mitigate any challenges that you may have faced. Again, we talked about, a communication strategy focusing clearly on vision and desired outcomes. So this means that you must have a deeper understanding of your mission, have a deeper understanding of your vision, have a deeper understanding of the desired outcomes. What is it that you want to achieve out of any communication that you engage in? Oftentimes there are outputs which are very basic, but what are the outcomes? What are the bigger goals, or what is the bigger purpose of what it is that you want to or you're doing? Outputs, for example, are the very basic. If you've trained maybe in this platform, there are so many people, you've shared with them certain material, you've spent 2 days training, those would be the basic outcomes, basic outputs. But what are the outcomes? Is it a deeper understanding of a communication strategy, a deeper understanding what the drafting and execution of communication strategies? So outcomes are much better in terms of what you want to achieve at the end of the day. I think earlier we alluded to the fact that there is need for rapid and timely response to issues, but this ought to be more proactive rather than reactive. Of course, from time to time, you might be facing crises, and consequently, you might be reacting to certain situations. But even when there's a crisis, normally there is, as part of the communication strategy, in that communication strategy, sometimes there is what we call crisis communications strategy, how to deal with a crisis that may emerge out of what it is that you're doing. So, how do you deal with crises using the communication strategy that you have? Of course, we also deal with intended audiences or primary audiences or target audiences that you draw. And of course, we believe that you must customize your message to be able to ensure that the target audiences have a buy-in into what it is that you're doing, the cause that you're trying to advance or promote, or whatever. Anyway, the bigger mission is that you're looking at. So these are the important or the essentials of a communication strategy. So mark those. You must have a statement of purpose. I think that is key, and we shall go into all that. You must do a situational context or environmental analysis, and we will look at the tools that you need to do that. We'll look at organizational objectives and communication objectives because, at the top of any organization, you have the mission and vision, but also the organizational objectives. What do you want to achieve as an organization? And from those objectives, then you come to communication objectives. Remember earlier we talked about if your organization has different programs, at the top, it's the organization objective. So, if you're dealing with gender-based violence, you want, of course, to eliminate gender-based violence, and that will be the main objective of your organization. But what are the communication objectives and under that? Again, we'll deal with that. We'll try and map stakeholders, audiences, because that is key. We've, constantly talked about segmenting audiences, identifying and segmenting audiences, from which then you're able to think about what kind of messages would resonate to them, and what communication methods would be more appropriate, in delivering whatever messages to those audiences. What is the work plan that you need to engage in, whatever it is that you're thinking about a communication strategy, and what are the tools that are available to you to be able to do an evaluation of your communication strategy. Remember what we said a few moments ago, that a communication is a process. It's not an event. It's a process that requires constant assessment to be able to determine how effective you've been, how effective the messages have been, whether the audiences that you've identified are fit for purpose, are important to achieving the organizational objectives. So assessment and the assessment tools must, of course, be appropriate in whatever it is that you do. And without further ado, I think we move to the next stage. So statement of the purpose. And earlier we asked ourselves, why the communication strategy? And what do you hope to achieve? And this is drawn from your mission and vision. So, if, for example, the basic communication, the basic purpose is for you to be known, because oftentimes there are so many organizations. So think about, for example, an ecosystem that has 10 NGOs trying to eradicate poverty, or trying to ensure that there is a deeper understanding of, say, the SDGs. And I think there are many of these. Think about an environment where there are 10 organizations that want to eradicate gender-based violence, or empower women. So what is it that you hope to achieve from the communication strategy? So think about the mission. If your mission is to eradicate, for example, all forms of gender-based violence by the year 2030, or think about, an instrument that is available to us, Agenda 2030, because that's a government instrument that hopes to achieve a certain development level by 2030, because there are various of those, but the Vision 2030 perhaps is one that we've perhaps interacted with, all of us, but also the SDGs, because those development goals are important in achieving maybe a global issues, whether it is, for example, ending poverty, promoting life, educating, people around the world. So if the purpose, for example, the purpose, the mission and vision is, the mission is to eradicate poverty or eradicate gender-based violence by 2030, you might want to ask yourself, why the communication strategy then? Why is communication important? And what is it that you need to communicate to ensure that there is a clear understanding, a clear and a deeper understanding within society of the issues that you are trying to promote? And the most important element then is ensuring that you come up with this purpose, because this is what will determine, for example, what messages you want to what messages you develop and disseminate, what channels you choose to communicate, what audiences you choose to communicate with, because at the end of the day, why you communicate and what you want to achieve is always important. So think of your organization. And I would, for example, by the end of maybe this conversation, ask, why is it that you want to communicate from your individual organization? Because by attending this meeting, for example, you want to be able to go back and if you don't have already a communication strategy, and say, tell your bosses or tell your colleagues that we need to start communicating because we want to be known, and we want to be known as an organization that is clear on what, or how we want to improve society. Because I'm sure that all of you are, whatever it is that you are, in one way or the other, you're working towards improving society, improving the conditions of the people that you're dealing with, or your primary public, anyway, the society in which you work. And, why the communication strategy will be answered by what do you hope to achieve at the end of the day. So purpose is the aim, purpose is the goal, and the purpose is, anyway, the overarching, factor and why you want to draw that communication strategy, why you want to invest in communication strategy, why you want to invest the resources that you may have, or discuss resources that you think will go into other areas, but think that communication is important. Remember also that this communication strategy must be acceptable within the internal environment in which you work in. If, for example, your bosses do not think that communication is important, then you struggle to convince them that communication strategy would achieve the overall vision and mission of your organization. So perhaps this is where you need to start from. Did I see a hand somewhere? Was it Jen? I saw someone raise their hand.
Yes, hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
My question was based on the statement of purpose, which I think you have explained well, because I was thinking the way you have explained, to me, it means that your organizational vision and purpose can be integrated when you are coming up with a strategy, or you can merge it to help you come up with a communication strategy.
All right. So in other words, I've responded to the question before you asked it, yes?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. All right. So anyway, so as you said, Jane, and as I said earlier, ensure that any communication strategy is aligned to your mission and vision. And I'm sure if you don't already have a vision, you should at least have a mission, because that is the basis upon which your organization is set up. An organization is set up to carry a certain mission in society. So, and I think I've given various examples of maybe eradicating poverty, eradicating the drug menace in society, achieving a cohesive society, achieving a society where there is no gender-based violence, achieving a society where, you know, women are empowered or girls are empowered, achieving a society where women's voices or girls' voices are privileged. So anyway, that is tied to whatever mission and vision that your organization, has. Okay, so situation analysis. What does the organization do? A situation analysis is an analysis of the situation, analysis of the environment in which you work in. And in doing a situation analysis, you want to understand, for example, what you do in the bigger ecosystem in which you work in. Again, if you work in the organizational education sector, for instance, if you work in the area of attempting to eradicate poverty or eradicate violence, or eradicate, drug dealing or drug the drug menace, you want to understand the environment in which you work in, vis-a-vis your own organization, and in the context of communication strategy, you want to be able to see the application of communications, the application of different strategies that you've used, for example, to communicate with your audiences, whether it's the general audience, whether it's secondary audience, whether it's the primary audiences. Of course, the idea is that all of us, by drawing the mission, you already understand who your primary audience is. So if you're dealing with, for example, eradicating poverty in Kibera, you already know that your target audience is the people living in Kibera. But you may want to segment that further into, Kibera is quite big. There's obviously the various informal settlements in Kibera, but there are other areas that are generally maybe middle class. I look at Kibera and and look at Woodley perhaps as being part of Kibera. I don't know exactly. I lived in Kibera a long time ago. I know that there's Fort Jesus, for example, there's Olympic. There are various other, estates within Kibera. I think that's what it's called now. And, if you want to eradicate then poverty, you may say that you're going to target the people living in informal settlements. And if your target audience has been people living in informal settlements of Gatwekera, Makina, and such places, what kind of communication have you been engaging with? And what are the strengths and weaknesses, for example, of the communication, any communication strategies that you've been deploying in those places, focusing on your various audiences, because you might choose to focus on young women, for example. You might choose to focus on the youth, youthful women, and say that your target audience is between 20 and 30. Or you might want to focus on the youth in general, people that perhaps fall in the age categories, demographic category of under 35, from maybe 15 to 35. And in analyzing, for example, that situation that you've been working in, analyzing the environment in which you've been working in, you may say this are the strengths that we've identified in whatever it is that we communicated, or in any communication work that we've done. We've used, for example, community radio, because we believe that is the most accessible radio station. We've used social media because that is the most accessible to the youth. We've used barazas because we believe that those are the in-person sessions or in-person meetings that people would privilege, because they're attended by leaders, they're attended by the government officials, they're attended by local leaders. And what can you do better, for example, or to achieve better results? And one of the things that we from time to time use in analyzing the situation is and communication, for example, situation is, what do you, for example, want to what have you done that you think is effective? What hasn't been effective? And if you able to determine what has been effective, what has not been effective, the other thing that perhaps you will move further into doing is, what do you need to continue doing? What is it that you may want to start doing, or what is it that you need to stop doing? So what is it that you want to continue doing because you believe that has achieved maybe the kind of results that you are looking for? So continue doing. What do you need to start doing because you believe that that can achieve better results? So continue doing and start doing. But what also do you need to stop doing because you believe that that is not desirable in the kind of communication that you engage in? Earlier, I talked about, for example, working in a conservative religious society where, for example, in Islam, maybe communicating using certain gender across, or in a meeting that is attended both men and women might not be effective because, that patriarchal environment, it does not maybe privilege women's voices. But what then can you do to ensure that, both women's voices and men's voices and children's voices or youth's voices are heard in that kind of environment? Anyway, a situation analysis is always important because it tells you what the situation is like, what the environment is like, and what that environment looks like in the context of what it is that you do and the kind of communication that you do. And it is through understanding the environment then you're able to come up with communication strategies that work. We always say that if you don't understand the environment, if you don't understand the context, if you don't understand the situation that you're in, it becomes very difficult for you to just go in and say, I want to communicate. So you must understand the people, for example, that you communicate with. You must understand what it is that they privilege. You must understand their situation. You must understand what platforms are important to them or accessible to any person that you're going to communicate. So a situation analysis is always important, and it relates very well to your own mission, because in your mission, if it's smart enough, it tells you that this is the environment that we're going to be working in. And if you don't understand then that environment, it becomes very difficult for you to be able to communicate. And there are various instruments that are available to you when you're doing a situation analysis. And I'll mention two that are often times used. I'm sure you've heard of the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You've also heard of PEST or PEST with an E or PESTOL analysis. And P stands for political, E stands for economic, S stands for sociocultural, E stands for environment or ethical environment. And ethical environment or environment could be ethical, could be political, it could be social, it could be a legal environment. And of course, technological environment is always also important in whatever you are doing, because all these have effects on what it is that you do. So a SWOT analysis, for example, when you're talking about the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, also, although oftentimes you can turn threats into opportunities because you believe that a threat can also become an opportunity. So if the threat is, for example, the increased post-election or violence as a consequence of political disputes, you can turn it into an opportunity where you want to educate people more to deal with, their anger, or to deal with the losses. And consequently, then it might be that you want to engage, say, in interventions that would educate people on political outcomes or political decision making and their own participation, say, in political activities. Anyway, a SWOT analysis allows to plan and manage communication, prepare for problems, because you've identified, for example, the strengths and weaknesses. Yeah. You've identified the threats, you've identified the opportunities that are available to you whenever it is that you dealing with communication. So very broadly, it allows you to identify strong and weak points and prepare for interventions. And you can do a SWOT analysis through brainstorming meetings, and I'm sure you can do these brainstorming meetings within an organization so that you identify, for example, the weaknesses or the strengths that you have as an organization. So if you're looking at gender-based violence and the CSO-based organization or grassroots-based organization, you might say one of the strengths that you have is the fact that you understand the local communities in which you work, understanding both, the cultures and attitudes of men in that community, understanding the cultures of the community in which you work in, understanding the perceptions, public perceptions about, say, gender-based violence or women empowerment or giving women a voice. And these internal brainstorming meetings are important in determining the kind of work that you're doing. But also you can have brainstorming meetings with the community in which you work in, so that you understand when you're doing a situation analysis, you understand what those communities, for example, privilege. If you're working in, to support the girl child, it's important to engage the community, maybe in small groups, what we call focus group discussions, for example, focus group discussions where you can bring, say, religious leaders, you bring together political leaders from that community, you bring together the business community, you bring together disabled communities, and all these groups, both professional, civil, and other communities, and ask them, for instance, what is it that we can do better to serve, or what can we do better to serve the community or the society in which you're engaging in. So brainstorming meetings are important. Problem solving meetings are important, and planning meetings, both internally and externally, are also very important, as well as evaluation at the end of the day, because you're able to say that these are the threats to the kind of communication, for example, that you want to engage in. Again, when you're looking at a patriarchal society in relation to gender-based violence, you may say that the threat to whatever it is that you do is the kind of messages that you're drawing, the kind of images that you share, the kind of stereotypes that are used in the drawing of the messages, because there's a lot of stereotyping, for instance, in whatever it is that we do. We might stereotype maybe certain communities. We might stereotype maybe youth in certain areas based on preconceived ideas, because we all have preconceived ideas about particular communities or particular ethnicities, and consequently, that evaluation will help you understand the threats to your own communication strategy. So a SWOT analysis is always important when you want to understand, for example, the situation in which you are working in. Jane, again, you got your hand up?
Professor, on the aspect of planning, when you are doing the SWOT analysis, what are these that it entail in planning?
when you're planning, for example, think about, for example, the strengths within the organization. Jane, where do you work? And perhaps I'll use your example.
I'm working with the women, grassroots women in gender-based violence and in poverty eradication.
Okay, so I think the example that I've been using refers to you, yeah? Gender-based violence, isn't it? Eradicating gender-based violence and poverty. Okay?
Yeah.
And I'm imagining that when you're planning, for instance, you might say, what are the strengths within our organization? The strengths is that you have maybe an expert, yeah, that understands what gender-based violence is. You might say you've got the resources that maybe other people don't have. You might have money, yes. You might have you might have the support of the local community, the local chief, or the administrators, the county commander, and things like that. And the political leaders have, are able to listen to you. But the threats is, for instance, the threats is the kind of messages that you draw, because those messages perhaps are strewn with stereotypes. Again, Jane, where do you work? For instance, where are you based?
I'm based in Embu.
Okay, you're based in Embu. Okay, I'm sure there are maybe stereotypes about the Embu people, but let me use the Meru people because they are not very far from where you are, isn't it?
Yes, I'm also Median, I understand.
All right, so one of the stereotypes that is associated with the Meru people is that they are very violent, and knife crime is very high there, isn't it? And some of the messages that we see then tend to stereotype the Meru people. That the men are very violent, especially towards their women. And those are the messages that sometimes we see. So radio stations would talk about, maybe men or mirror chewing, for example, contributes to psychological violence. Men maybe misusing family resources is a threat to maybe the kind of relationships that ought to exist between men and women. But once then you determine that those messages haven't resonated with the Meru, the Embu people or the Meru people, that is a threat to your communication strategy. But how can you then turn that threat to an opportunity? Because that opportunity, that threat then allows you to understand the weaknesses in your communication strategy and turn those threats to your communication into opportunity. In which case, if you've been using stereotypes, you say what opportunity maybe exists within these stereotypes. If you think that men have been misusing their maybe the money that they earn from the Mira business, how can you turn maybe messaging on Mira business into a strength? Okay, and it could be that Mira is seen as a product that can empower people. Mira is seen as a product that using value addition. For instance, I've seen Mira wine and Mira, I can't remember what the other thing was, Mira wine and Mira juice, for instance. How can you turn Mira from being a drug, because I think that's what we understand it to be mostly, into a product that can empower the local people, and using that to show that you can turn the negative Mira campaign that has led to, say, banning of Mira in the UK and other places into a product that is acceptable to most people. So at the planning stage, you'll be able to determine the strengths and weaknesses of your campaigns and the opportunities and threats that are, the threats that are available to the communication campaign, but also the opportunities that you have. The fact that maybe you have the opportunity to engage with the local leaders is, is one way of dealing with the threats. So the planning stage, I think, is where you actually do all this. Deal with, look at or use the SWOT as an instrument to look at very broadly assessing the communication strategy and saying, how can you make it stronger? Okay. I hope that responds to your question,
Thank you.
Jane. All right, very good.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So anyway, so there is also the PESTOL analysis. As we said, PEST stands for political, economic, socio-technological, legal, and environment. And I think there are various, ways to look at this. Political, for example, you're looking at the political situation at the moment when we analyze communication strategies around elections. The political situation is one that, can turn violent, for example, from time to time. We have a situation where, maybe political parties are struggling to get space within the broader, society. We also look at government stability and instability in some situations. In conflict situations, for example, you have government instability, but you also have, in the Kenyan situation, you have the two-tier government system, for example, the national government and the developed government, or the local government in your developed your county government. So county and national government. So two tiers. There are, of course, some governments that are more stable than others in different places based on, for example, governance issues. You may find, a county government that is more stable, a county government that is very fluid, and consequently, that may affect the kind of work that you do. So in a situation where there is infighting, for example, within the county government, that may destabilize the relationship that you have with the local leadership, with the MCAs, and that may affect the kind of work that you do. We also deal with regulation. Sometimes, especially in those, for those that work in an environment where you may be wanting to promote reproductive health, for example. The Kenya Film Classification Board, for instance, did not allow the campaigns on the use of condoms, for example. You might find a situation where, you have a government that does not allow, or a political situation that does not allow the promotion of contraceptives. And those political then factors may affect your work if you're dealing with reproductive health. So the political environment is one that is key to achieving your communication objectives. The economic, of course, the labor costs, the employment or unemployment trends, growth rates, also affect the kind of work that you do. Social, and I'm sure maybe this is self-explanatory, the education level sometimes affects the understandability of your message, the access of your message. We know that religious and local beliefs and cultures also have a bearing on messaging. Again, reproductive health in terms of religion becomes very tricky. Age distribution, minorities also fall under that category. Technological, earlier we talked about the use of social media. But how many people have access to social media? How many people, for example, use various platforms like WhatsApp? And how can you then utilize maybe the opportunities that you have to be able to ensure that those technologies are not a threat to whatever it is that you're doing? So technology, it can be an enabler, but also a barrier to sometimes effective communication. The legal environment, again, media law sometimes prevents the publication of certain messages that may be seen as insensitive to local cultures. We know that intellectual law affects, the kind of messaging or what text that you can use, what pictures, what material you can use in your campaigns. Environmental, sometimes we know weather is a factor in the kind of communication work that you do. If you are organizing local barazas, then you might be thinking, what is the best period in which to organize public campaigns, at what time? For instance, if you go to rural communities like, maybe Meru, Embu, maybe Thika, you know that organizing meetings in the mornings might not work because people are, busy at their workplaces, or during the cold weather, they might not turn up if it's an outside meeting. So, when do you organize your meetings, for example? When do you organize your communication? So all these factors have a bearing on the communication. And this will help you then understand the situation in which you're working in. If the political environment makes it difficult for you to communicate, then you, at the planning stage, you have to deal with political factors that may be an impediment to your communication. If you think that the social factors will affect the understanding of your messages, then you may want to disaggregate your audiences into people that have gone to school, or people that have a certain level of education, and people that may not have maybe, or have people have a certain level. Anyway, levels of education matter. And that also means, use of language. If perhaps people are very educated, then you want to use English, a certain level of English. If you think that maybe certain messages will not be understandable because people don't know English, then Swahili or local languages may be important. And this also determines what kind of platform you use. Particularly when you look at radio and television, we know that local language television or radio are very effective sometimes based on where it is that you're based. So that will be affected, of course, by the level of education, will be affected by religious, the norms and cultures in certain situations. We talked about technology and how that affects communication. And I think if you do a pastoral analysis, perhaps, which is maybe better than a SWOT analysis, then you're able to determine how the environment looks like, how the situation looks like before you can get into a proper communication itself. Of course, you can apply the two. You can do a SWOT analysis and complement it with a pastoral analysis. There's nothing that would prevent you from doing the two, because one of the weaknesses that you may identify would be political, economic, or social. But at the same time, you need to go deeper and try to identify the social impediments or the social opportunities that you may have when you're dealing with the messages. So anyway, as we said, there are simple and effective tools used in situation analysis to identify the key external forces that might affect your organization. I think that is important to understand both the external environment and even the internal environment, because within the internal environment, there are dynamics that may prevent you from engaging in effective communication, particularly when we look at the SWOT analysis. The internal environment might be best analyzing, maybe using the SWOT analysis. So, the aim is, of course, to find the external factors, especially with this analysis, that might affect your work and the organization. Identify factors that may change in future, that may present the current impediments, but also exploit the opportunities to respond to the various threats that you may be facing. So the next stage is, of course, organizational and communication objectives. As we said, the overall mission and aims and objectives of the organization are key to drawing an effective communication strategy, because everything that you do must align to the vision and mission that you have, because it is through the mission, the organization's mission, that you're able to draw the communication objectives. And again, from this vision and mission, you're able to draw the operational policy objectives, and how those align to the communication objective. And as you do these objectives, you must think of the SMART approach. As a SMART approach, I'm sure maybe you've heard this numerous times. S stands for specific. There must be specific objectives. They must be, specific. So again, let's use the gender-based violence. You must specify exactly what it is that you hope to achieve, because any ambiguity means that, you may be struggling to understand what it is that you're dealing with exactly. They must be measurable in the sense, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that you must, for example, state exactly what it is that you want to achieve within a certain period. And this relates to, the A, which is attainable results or results oriented. They must be time limited so that you're working, for example, at achieving something, say in the context of the current political environment, before the next general election, whose date we know. And, in understanding the vision and mission, you're able then to use that to draw the operational or policy objectives. You're able to draw the communication objectives. And all this must align for you to be able to get the buy-in, particularly from the internal environment. I think it's important for you to think very critically about how any communication strategy addresses the vision and mission of your organization. I'm trying to take you through this quickly because I think we only have about 5 minutes. We've overrun our time, but Mustafa said that we can go up to 11:30. Anyway, so in thinking about SMART, what is it that you want to achieve? And that's the question that I've put out there. What do I want to achieve? So specific, be precise about what you're going to achieve, okay? Be measured. I mean, when you're talking about measurable, it's the quantify your objectives, yeah? Achievable, are you attempting enough or too much? And this is based on, for example, when you're thinking about measurable, specific, and achievable, based on the resources that are available to you. If you don't have enough staff, for example, it would be very difficult for you to come up with a very ambitious project, because that would then not be achievable at the end of the day. How much money, for example, do you have to ensure if you're, dealing, for example, with gender-based violence at a national level, do you have enough resources to go around the country? So, are you being realistic in the context of the available resources, particularly time resources, monetary resources, human resources? So always think about, the objectives being achievable, realistic. Do you have enough resources to achieve, the objectives? I think it is always important for you to be realistic based on the fact that you have scarce resources. And those resources I've mentioned: monetary, human, time resources. And always state exactly when you want to achieve whatever it is that you've drawn, whatever it is that you've drawn. And this is an example of, for example, policy objective vis-a-vis communication objective. So, I've used this example just to illustrate what it is that we're dealing with. And I think maybe this can fall even within the ambit of gender-based violence, because we know that most domestic workers are, for example, women. So the policy objective would be to improve the welfare of domestic workers, but the communication objective is to ensure that society knows the working conditions of domestic workers, okay? And that means then choosing the message, ensuring that you possess the resources, and that you know the communication channels that you're going to use for society to understand what it is that you are going to achieve. Again, maybe the next policy objective: to enhance the working conditions of sex workers. You may want to provide monthly reports. And this then shows that, it's measurable, because they are monthly reports. They are achievable in the sense that, these are just reports on the condition of sex workers. So think about what it is that you looking at vis-a-vis what you're trying to communicate. General versus specific examples. Influence national policy on the welfare of domestic workers. You may want, for example, the specific objective, and here you can see the specifics, is to change national policy. So that's national policy on the working conditions of domestic workers by a certain time, 2022. So always draw a time by which you think this is achievable. But of course, always be realistic, given the fact that in doing whatever you're doing, you'll have to lobby different people, different organizations for you to try and achieve your specific objective. Again, the same applies to improving the working conditions of sex workers in Kenya. That's a general objective. So the specific objective is to lobby for the enactment of legislation to enhance this, the conditions of sex workers by 2025. You have a time, you have what it is that you are looking for, which is the enactment of legislation. So very specific examples between the general, which may seem very abstract and very ambitious, but this must be followed by very specific objectives. And I think those examples better illustrate what it is that you want to achieve. Tips for developing smart objectives: work on short-term, mid-term, and long-term plans, but around 5 years, because 5 years is considered perhaps an appropriate time within which to achieve some of these things. Always be realistic in terms of timeframes. We talked about this, budgets and resources, and of course the measurement. Timeframes are especially critical. You want to achieve something by a certain date. You have maybe a certain budget from which to borrow and within which to work. And you have certain resources, including, of course, monetary, human resources that you already can identify and can already say this is what we are going to work with. And of course, the measurement instruments are important whenever it is that you're developing this. Okay, stakeholders, we talked about internal and external. We talked about secondary and primary audiences. We've talked about potential audiences, and especially who is it that you're keen to connect with? Is it young people? Is it women? Is it men? Is it youth? And, by being able to identify and segment and disaggregate those audiences, I think you're able then to connect with them, because you'll be able to draw maybe certain messages. You'll be able to identify the channels that you think are accessible to them. And by understanding that, you're able then to achieve your objectives. Consider your audience needs. We talked about cultural needs. Values and norms are always important. And when you do a situation analysis, try as much as possible to understand the cultures in which you work in and the various norms that may prevent what it is that you're going to do. And the practical needs, I think, is what you talked about earlier, access to media and other resources. Think about the demographics that you're working with. Gender issues, age issues, ethnicity issues are always important when you're talking about stakeholders or audiences. You also have to think about messages, of course. What is your message? I think that is a key issue. What is your message? Yeah, what is the message? This must be drawn together with, of course, the audiences that you already segmented, because, you know, if you're dealing with young people, if you're dealing with perhaps people that are between 15 and 18, or the youth up to 35, you might have to draw different messages for different people. If you work in a religious environment, you may want to draw messages for men. You may want to draw your audiences for women, so that whatever message resonates with the different people that you are targeting. And in drawing the messages, one of the key questions that you ask yourself is how appropriate are the messages? I mentioned earlier, for example, the use of billboards to communicate condom use. For instance, the regulator, when you're looking at the political environment and regulation, the Kenya Film Classification Board was, keen on bringing down those billboards because they thought the messages were not appropriate, especially in public spaces. And the Kenya Film Classification Board were also, keen on ensuring that certain messages were not communicated within a certain period, particularly on popular media like radio and television and even online spaces. So, for instance, if you're working in the LGBT community and wanting to promote those messages, you may ask yourself whether certain messages are appropriate for general audiences, and how, for example, you draw specific messages that resonate with maybe different audiences that you've already identified, whether it's from a religious perspective. And if you want to communicate with religious organizations, for example, you may want to frame those messages as being human rights messages. And those then would seem appropriate in the context in which you're working, despite the fact that LGBT is a fairly difficult subject to deal with in the context of our society, where we know different cultures, or we know that this is the kind of resistance that you're likely to face when you're communicating with the general public. Communication methods, again, ask yourself what channels are available to you. We've said, and you talked earlier about sometimes the challenges of accessing popular media like television or radio, but also the fact that you can access, social media fairly easily. But if you access social media, who has access to that? You must be able to do, when you're doing your situation analysis, must be able to determine whether social media, for example, is appropriate for communicating with the general public, or what, for example, social media means to different audiences. When you're talking about maybe young urban audiences, then you may want to privilege social media as opposed, say, to newspapers. You may want to use social media instead of radio. You may want to use Instagram instead of Twitter. So you must be able to determine what channels are available to you, what channels are would be accessible to whoever it is that you want to communicate with. And as you do this, always think about the pros and cons. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using certain platforms or communication methods. And there are various, these pros and cons that would come up during the planning stages. But this means that, as I said, that the communication is a continuous process, which means you must constantly evaluate the different methods, for example, different messages that you're putting out there to be able to come up with new strategies or new channels based, of course, on who it is that you're going to talk about. So I've, again, drawn examples there. You're talking about local community, key message, in political environment is that we want, for example, if the key message that you want to communicate is we want you to vote, then town halls, barazas, radio, television might be the most appropriate. And I think you've seen, for example, in the recent past, as part of civic education that is offered prior to the 2022 general election, that, the key message has been you must vote, or you should vote, or your vote counts, for instance. And the channels that you use would be, the ones that would reach as many people as possible. Town halls, or these are public meetings, and radio and television, and social media to some extent is important. When you're talking about the youth, the young people, and again, you're talking about elections and voting, it could be that social media becomes then key. Jane, I'll come back to you. You're talking about if you're targeting political leadership or national leadership, and if your message is about maybe the standards of living right now, based on the fact that poverty levels are increasing, and then policy briefs would be important, emails would be important, and occasionally maybe town halls and radio and television and newspapers would also be important. We talked about the work plan, key communication activities. You must look at the resources and budgets. I think those are important. You must talk about the time plans that you have. You must look at the milestones that you want to achieve over time that you're looking at, and ultimately, of course, you must assess or evaluate your communication strategy, and particularly ask yourself, what does success look like? How do you know when your objectives have been met, or when your communication has failed? Oftentimes, we try and conduct opinion polls or conduct surveys, perhaps not opinion polls, but surveys using a questionnaire. Some of these sometimes are challenging, but I'm sure, just to use an example from this platform, the host of this meeting is going to send you a questionnaire to ask you, whether what we've learned here is useful, or what was not useful, or whether this will be helpful in drafting your own communication strategy. The same can be applied in any communication that you do. You should always seek feedback from the people that you deal with, or the organizations with the people that you deal with, so that you're able to understand whether, for instance, the channels have been successful, whether the messages resonate with the people. And I think in assessing whatever it is that you do, you are able then to either invest more, invest more resources, particularly if you think that would contribute to the achievement of your vision and mission. You invest more resources, or you stop certain campaigns because you think they're alienating you from your target audiences, and things like that. Anyway, the most critical thing with regard to assessment evaluation is that it is key to the development of any communication strategy, because this tells you whether what you have will contribute to the success of your campaigns, to the success of your communication on whatever issue or not, and the metrics of success, calculating positive press or not, or whether you've gotten positive or negative press, will determine then whether you want to continue with that, will determine whether you evaluate what you already have, and whether to continue or stop what it is that you're doing. I think Jane, I saw again your hand.
No, it was a mistake. Sorry, Professor.
All right, very good. Okay, then I will stop there and ask whether there are questions, comments, and I hope that we'll have discussions. But I've had to maybe move quickly. Again, this will be shared with you, and we can always continue with the conversations at another time if I'm invited to another session like this. So, any questions? Any further questions? Any comments? Any clarifications?
Well, Prof, thank you so much. It's been quite very engaging content. And for everyone, it's still an opportunity for you to ask follow-up questions, share a comment with Prof, engage him on the contents that he has presented to you. Still a good opportunity to do so. You can unmute to do so, or you can also just go to the chat and share. Well, Prof, sounds like it seems to me it's quite crystal clear. If no one was asking follow-up questions.
It could be the time as well.
Yeah, exactly. It could be time as well, but we are still under 12, so we will wrap up this very soon. But I also just like to take this opportunity to welcome Brian Post, who is with us. Brian is joining us from the Canadian mission in Kenya. Brian, welcome and thanks for joining us. Brian will, before we close the session, Brian will share a few thoughts with us from the embassy, and then we will wrap up this session. But before we invite Brian, we will still leave the platform open for you to engage Prof directly on the content he has shared. Any thoughts from any of you? And definitely there will be next steps, because there is a hand up. Karibu.
Yes, me is to thank the professor, because the content has been very informative, clear, and simple. It will help us to come up with our communication strategies. So I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Thanks, Jen.
Yes, I'm saying thank you very much to Professor for the input. The content has been quite informative. It has been, the presentation was very simple and clear. I'm grateful for that.
Right, Jen, thank you. Are there any more thoughts, questions maybe? Yes. It's still Jen's hand is still up. Do we still have Naomi around?
Yes, I'm here, Mustafa.
How was the training?
Very informative and challenging. Our organization was recently in the process of institutional system strengthening, and we got some bit of help coming up with HR policies, finance, procurement, and a review of the strategic plan. So I'm truly grateful that now I have some training on how to come up with a communication strategy, something that our organization did not have. So these are plus for organization, and thank you so much for this forum. Thank you, Prof, for your insights and your expertise in this area that you have willingly shared.
Prof, that was a kudos to you. Do you have any more thoughts? I saw there was something on the chat, and that's from Mariam. Mariam was saying the session was informative, and I feel enlightened so much in the communication strategy. Mariam, we're glad that you've learned something from this. And colleagues, the important aspect of this engagement is that it shouldn't, the important aspect of this engagement is that it shouldn't last here at all. The goal is for us to actually help you to prepare a communication strategy for your different, to develop a communication strategy for your different institutions. So while we may not have enough time to actually get into the practical bit of it now, what the next steps of this engagement will be, we're going to share this material with you. We can share the link with you, and we'll encourage you to go ahead and develop a draft strategy for your institution, and based on the information that you've acquired in the past 2 days. Remember where we started yesterday. We started with a clear introduction to the Kenyan media landscape, exposing you with your participation on the Kenyan media landscape, the terrain, what different platforms are there, what are the dynamics of their operations. But then we also spoke quite in depth on the building professional relationships with the media and how to go about that. We did provide tips on how to build professional relationships with the media, and based on your feedback this morning, it came out clearly that you've understood those steps and why it's important for you to build those relationships with journalists. Understanding, putting yourself in their shoes. We did speak lengthily as well how to pitch to media, because that's something very important in your day-to-day practice about how do you package information, how do you share information with media that journalists will be, you can excite journalists to cover stories about your activities and the work that you do. Remember, we spoke about what is newsworthy, because that's what journalists are looking out for. While your intention is to promote your work, journalists, on the other hand, have an obligation to their audience to provide information that is newsworthy. So we did discuss yesterday what that means, what that term newsworthy. So we hope that you don't forget, and your next engagement with journalists will take that into consideration. And then, of course, today, Prof has taken us through a very long and useful presentation on developing a communication strategy. This is still fresh in your minds. So I hope that you found these 2 days are quite worthwhile, worth your time, and you will put into practice the skills and knowledge you've acquired in this past 2 days in your organization. So the next step will be, we will keep in touch with you. We'll follow up with you regarding the next steps. But what I can already tell you at this point is, when you go back, you do have an assignment to develop a communication strategy. And the next couple of weeks, we will reconvene to actually go through. You will share those in advance with us. We'll review, and Prof will come again, so we can go through those strategies. So just make sure that we provide feedback. Prof will provide feedback on those strategies. So on that note, from my end, I like to take this opportunity again to thank you all for your time, for joining us. And we hope, again, you found this worthwhile. I have the honor now to invite Brian Post, who is joining us from the, where do we send the communication strategies? The communication strategies, you can send them to Bernard Ogoy. Bernard will share his email Bernard will share his email with you on the chat, so you can send the strategies to Bernard, please. Yes, Bernard has shared his email on the chat. Please share your strategies to Bernard, and then we can move on to the next stages. This is really, we'll encourage you to do this. We will help you provide feedback and shape those strategies so that you can actually, it's not just a document, but it's a document that you can use in your day-to-day work. Thank you very much for that. The next step will be, we will have to do an evaluation for this training. So Bernard will keep in touch with you again. He will share a Google Doc link with you to just get feedback about whether you find this training useful and whether you have any suggestions for us to improve on it. So we do thank you once more for your time. Again, I do now have the honor to invite any of you, if you have any thoughts to share, any comment to make, before we invite our guest of honor, Brian Post, to share his statements with us, and then we can wrap up this training. Any thoughts from you?
Mustafa, I think I did see a hand from either Anne or I don't know, but maybe it's
so if I may not see because the presentation is still shared. Maybe Prof can edit. Yes, fantastic. Santi Prof. So if you have your hand up, please just go ahead and speak. That's fine. Okay, then if you're not, then I'll.
Yes, there is Isabel.
Isabel Karibu.
Thanks, Mustafa. Mine is just to appreciate yourself, as well as all the presenters for the knowledge and the experience shared. I think for me, I've gleaned a lot from both sessions. In terms of follow-up, so I know we're gonna share our strategies and work plans at some point, but also I wanted to find out whether it's possible for you to share with us maybe your database of journalists and editors in the different sectors, like for ourselves in the education sector, and also gender. So those would be really helpful, so that they can be a good starting point for us to also follow through with some of these things, like creating relationships, or rather building relationships with the media. So I don't know whether that's possible. Thanks.
Isabel, that's a request that we will consider, and for sure, Bernard, who is here with us, has a wide network of contact with the different media houses, because as we mentioned yesterday, we do work with journalists across the country. So we will have to, we'll keep these journalists engaged, and then we'll create a database as you've requested to share. But that's a good point, and we've taken note of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I saw Safia's hand was up. Is it still up, Safia? Okay, well, on that point, I would like to invite Professor Nyambuga for his final, not his final, will still be with us, but for his, it's kind of a send away message to all of us today. Professor Nyambuga.
No, Mustafa, thank you very much for the opportunity to share this with the participants here. As you rightly pointed out, I'll be available to offer any support that participants may need with regard to their communication strategies. So please keep them coming, and I'm hoping that today's session has been useful. But clearly, from what we've heard, it has been. So I'm delighted that we are able to share the knowledge with you. And but the most important thing is, of course, to apply this knowledge in developing the strategies, but executing the communication strategies. And hopefully that will help your organizations achieve your organizational goals. And of course, the bigger mission and vision that you set yourselves. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your time as well, and for your expertise, and for agreeing to do this with us and continue to supporting the journalists as well as civil society partners that we work with. Asante Sana, thank you. So I have now the honor at this point to invite Brian Post to share with us a few thoughts. Brian Post is joining us from the Canadian mission. And remember, we did mention in our opening yesterday that the Canada World Project that we are implementing in Kenya and a couple of other countries is funded by the Canadian government through Global Affairs Canada. Brian, it's my honor to have you here and also to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Mustafa. So my name is Brian Post. I am the Deputy Head of Cooperation at the Canadian High Commission in Nairobi. I'm going to keep my remarks very short because I know you've had a lot of information to absorb this past two mornings. So thank you for inviting me. Special thanks to the organizers, Journalists for Human Rights and Kenya Editors Guild. I'm sorry that I couldn't join for more of the training. I've just caught the last hour or so, which has been revealing, I think, in terms of how valuable this is. I would have liked to have joined for more. I think that these are such valuable skills. We can do a lot of work on the ground in our communities, but I think we all have a goal to see bigger change of some sort. And I heard you talking about exactly that point a little while ago. So whether it's combating climate change or empowering women and girls or protecting disability rights or eradicating poverty or the many other worthy causes that I think you all support every day, bringing about change requires that we communicate effectively, that we tell our stories to the wider world, and that we start a discussion. So I see this training as having a multiplier effect. It expands, you extend your story from your community outwards to Kenya and then to the world. Of course, this is doubly important these days. We live in a world that's saturated with misinformation. So we do need to ensure that truth is heard, that your truth is heard, and that lies are exposed. So I hope you've all taken some small or maybe large steps towards those objectives, that you feel excited about getting your story out, about making sure the truth is heard, and ultimately creating change. So congratulations on the work you've completed, and I look forward to seeing what you do next. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Aban. It's a pleasure to have you here again. I'm sorry for my background. These are some of the challenges that comes with working from home with a toddler. my apologies for that. But colleagues all, we've come to the end of this training, and we're glad that you've all made the time to join us. We will keep in touch with the next steps. Please, my colleague Bernard has already shared his email on the chat. Please, maybe it's good for us to have kind of like a deadline for this com strategy, so we don't leave it open. So I will say a deadline for you to submit. A deadline for you to submit this document will be mid next month. It's 2 weeks of fair time for everyone. so probably then we see a deadline for the submission of this document will be on the 15th of, the 15th of July. Will that work? Does anyone have any issues with the date? Is it too soon? Is it too long? The 15th? We'll go with the 15th of July as a deadline. So if you can submit a draft comm strategy for your organization. Remember what Prof said earlier, a communication strategy could be for the whole organization, but also within the bigger strategy, you can have smaller strategies for specific projects. So for now, I think what we will go for is for a bigger strategy for your organization. Once we get it right, then it means you can do the other smaller ones, for specific programs of your organization. We look forward to receiving and to reading them. We'd like to thank you very much. We will share with you materials relating to this training, which means the links to the links to the Zoom recordings, and as well as PowerPoint presentations. I did already share with you yesterday the tip sheet for building relationship with the media. So you can read that and then use that as well to your advantage to continue building those relationships. I would like to thank everyone for your time. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Journalists for Human Rights, who have all been working really hard behind the scenes to making sure that we're able to get this training to happen. I would like to thank particularly my colleague Bernard Ogoy and Sami Muraya, who is not with us at the moment, but also for the work that he did behind the scenes, making sure that we get this thing happen. We are also really grateful for the support from the Canadian government through Global Affairs Canada for the generous grant to get this important work going on the ground. We're grateful for that, and we're looking forward to continue to working with all of you. Have a great day and a great week, a great rest of the week. Bana, do you have anything from you? I think that's it for me.
Yeah, that's it, Mustafa. I'm sure in the course of, if not by tomorrow, by Monday, my colleague Penina will also do some communication. I think that's important in terms of data reimbursements.
Okay, thank you.
And
so
I
much.
hope we all indicated our registered phone numbers just to make communication easier, because sometimes we find numbers that come with the names that we don't have in the registration. It becomes a challenge.
Mustafa.
Thank you so much.
Mustafa.
Yes, it is.
Yes, Mustafa, you can close.
All right. Okay. Yes, we've come to the end, colleagues, and thank you all. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.